Salute to everyone. Welcome to my channel, Chess with Arsalan. In previous video, we saw that how Kasparov managed to crush Karpov in the second game of the World Chess Championship match in 1990. Now it's game number 7, and it's Karpov's turn to have white pieces. So he started with d4, and Kasparov replied with his customary King's Indian. And they reached to this position, and here Kasparov played knight a6. He also played this move in the game number 7 in the match, and previously had played queen e7, and later on in the match e takes d4, but here knight a6 was played, and after castle kingside, knight to g4. Karpov was expecting c6 in this position, but Kasparov writes that literally 1 hour before the game he changed his mind, and he played knight g4, bishop g5, hitting the queen, f6. In following year, queen e8 was played in a game between Vladimir Kramnik and Veselin Topalov in Nice 2008. It was a rapid game, but here Kasparov played f6 and then bishop c1. King h8 by Garry Kasparov, and here Karpov played h3. There is also possibility of c5 in the position, but it's not Karpov's taste. It leads to very dynamic positions and very complicated positions, but this is not what Karpov likes to play. So h3 by Anatoly Karpov, pushing the knight back to h6. This is the only available square. And here Karpov decided to simplify. He played d takes e5. There were other options, for example, bishop e3 in this position, which is not better than what Karpov played, or rook to b1, trying to create an offense on the queen side by playing b4 and then c5. But again, we know that Karpov is a simple man, so he played d takes e5. And unlike Karpov, Kasparov is not a simple man, and he captured with f takes e5 in this position. After d takes e5, queen takes d8, the position will be drawish and very dry, and this is not what Kasparov likes, so he played f takes e5. Bishop e3 by Anatoly Karpov. He is aiming to control the square that the knight is going to land on. Knight f7, queen to d2, and then knight to c5. And here there are actually some interesting variations. Here Karpov played knight g5 in this position, and there are some interesting plans hidden in that move. But let's see what happens if, for example, white plays bishop takes c5, exchanging the bishop for the knight. And after d takes c5, surprisingly, this position is equal. Yes, the 4 majority pawn against 3 on the queen side is ineffective, because obviously they cannot produce a passed pawn. Yes, the e5 pawn is very weak, and it will be isolated for the rest of the game. But in return, what black has here is the dark square bishop, and it can be immediately activated via h6. And since white does not have such a piece in his own camp, it will be very difficult to counter this bishop. So this was bishop takes c5. What about rook f to d1? Of course, the plan is to play rook a to c1, b4, and then starting an offense with c5. Or something even sharper. White can play b4 immediately, and this will lead to a very swift change in the position. For example, knight e6, and here the knight is going to land on d4 or on d4 or f4, and if white, for example, prevents that by g3, prevents landing of the knight on f4, then c5 can be played, and in the next move knight to d4, and the position will be pleasant for black. But because it's sort of complicated position, Karpov did not show any enthusiasm going into this variation. So he played knight g5, and this will introduce some new and very unusual ideas in the position. Now, what is so unusual about this move? Obviously, Black's main idea, Black's main theme, main plan in the position is to attack on the king side, and two of very important pieces that can be used in this attack is the knight and bishop on c8. So by playing knight g5, white is trying to exchange a pair of knights and also exchange the bad bishop on e2 for the good bishop on c8. So that's why this plan was actually, despite being very unusual, it was very interesting. So knight takes g5, bishop takes, and then bishop f6, blocking the bishop. Obviously this is a very good bishop, so it should be saved. So bishop e6, bishop e3, excuse me, and here Karpov executes his plan, bishop g4. Now, in this position, Kasparov played h5, and he forced the exchange of the bishop for the knight. But let's see what happens if the usual moves are played in the position. For example, what happens after knight f4? In this position, white has two main options. Number one is to exchange on the c8 immediately, and after queen to c8, knight d5 and g5, and it will lead to a very complicated position. For example, rook a to d1, c6, knight takes f6, rook takes c5, which is not the best move in the position, knight takes h3, sacking the knight, g takes, queen takes, f3, and after rook takes, and queen takes, this position is equal. Despite being a piece up for 3 pawns, this position is equal. Now, after knight f4, white has yet another option, and it's to play knight d5 immediately. And if black tries to launch an attack with g5, then rook a to d1 can be played, and after playing f3, strengthening the white's pawn structure on the center, and giving the fact that this bishop is outside of its pawn structure, so it will be a very good bishop. White will have no concern about executing the main plan, which is c5. So white can play c5 immediately, or in case of b6, b4 and then c5. So knight f4, probably not a very good move. What about knight d4? This one is very interesting. Here white can exchange on c8 immediately and put the knight on b5, and the aim is to exchange the knight on d4. And if black plays c5, planting the knight on d4, then this knight will come back to c3, and this position is much better for white. It's black will have black should try very hard to obtain a draw. Why? Because this bishop is locked behind its pawn. It's very difficult to find good places for heavy pieces. And yes, this knight is very good, but it's not doing anything special in the position. So knight d4, probably not a good move as well. So what was Kasparov move here? It was h5, and it forced an exchange on e6, and then white played knight d5, and here Kasparov, obviously this knight is attacking the missed arrow. This knight is attacking bishop on f6. So Kasparov decided to preserve this bishop by playing bishop h4. You should note that bishop g7 is not a very good move here in this position, because then, for example, after bishop g5, queen to d7, rook a to d1, rook f7, and f3. The only open file in the position is f5 for black, and the f3 pawn cannot be challenged. Excuse me. F3 pawn cannot be challenged because these two pawns are locked by black's pieces, mainly the bishop. So white will have a free hand, to attack on the queen side, in the queen side, without being worried about the king side attack by black. So that's why bishop g7 in this position is not a good move. So Kasparov preserved the bishop another way, and here Karpov played rook a to c1. First of all, you should know that do not play g3 trying to kick the bishop back, because in that case black will have a chance to sack a piece by playing bishop takes h3, g takes, and queen takes h4, and then black will have enough compensation. Compensation for the sacrificed piece. Bishop takes a7, another very interesting possibility that might have worked in another position, is not going to work. Now, what's the idea behind bishop takes a7? Basically, white is trying to take advantage of the poor position of the bishop on e6. How? White is going to play bishop and queen h6, check. After queen to g8, then queen takes g6 check, and after the queen comes back to h8, then this bishop on e6 will be hanging. So that's why the bishop was removed from e3 square. But here the problem is that black can exchange this bishop, and after queen takes queen h6 and queen takes g6, then both of the queen h5 and queen h6 will lead to a draw. So bishop a7 is not going to work in this position. So rook a to c1 was played, king h7, and rook to c3. Probably an inaccuracy. Now the better move was to play b3, strengthening the pawn on c4, and there black could have played c6, and black's defense is very solid. Yes, there's a pressure on d6 square, but there will be a solid defense in that case. So Karpov played rook c3, obviously transferring rook to the third rank. Exact place is not known yet. So here Kasparov returned the favor and played an inaccuracy himself. He played rook f7. He should have take advantage of the poor positioning of the knight on d5, and he could have played b3 in this position. And after this, he should have played c6 in the position. And after knight b4 and then rook f7 and transferring the knight to the d7, and then putting the knight on a5 and rook a to d8, then black will gradually prepare the position for the breakout of the d5. So this could have been the idea, but now that the move order is sort of altered, rook f7 by Kasparov, now white will gain a chance, which Karpov did not seize. Karpov here in this position played b3. He could have played rook d3, obviously making the c3 square available for the knight. And if here black plays c6, trying to again taking advantage of the poor positioning of the knight, then knight c3 could have been played, and after bishop takes c4, rook takes d6, attacking the queen, then queen b8 for example, rook d7, bishop e7, bishop g5, bishop takes g5, rook takes, king h6, queen to d7, take on f7, take on f7, and this position will bring black many problems for obtaining a draw. So b3 was not a good move, and white should have played rook to d3, but b3 was played, and c3 was finally played, knight b4 and then knight d7. And here Karpov made another mistake. Here he played rook c to c1. What he should have done was to play rook to d1. But to be very optimistic, to be very optimistic, it's not promising too much for white. So rook c to c1 was played, and then bishop f6. The bishop is returning to its customary diagonal, king's Indian diagonal. And here Karpov started the offense by playing f4. E takes f4 was played, and after bishop takes a4, we reach to a very interesting position in the game. And what is that? Here Kasparov made, I would say, a childish mistake, and he played queen a5. This is a blunder. There were other possibilities here. For example, black could have played queen e7 or even g5. For example, let's analyze the g5. After g5, after g5, bishop e3, g4, h takes, and bishop takes, and the g file is now open for black's pieces. It could have give black some sort of a chance to have a better game. But Kasparov played queen a5, and he missed the tactic. What he missed was knight d5 by Anatoly Karpov. It was played. The knight d5 was played in the game. But before we analyze the knight d5, you should know that this is aiming to take advantage of the poor positioning of the queen in the position. But white cannot play knight c6. White cannot play knight c6 in order to take advantage of this mistake. Why? Because, for example, after queen takes d2, then bishop takes can be played, and rook f7, obviously protecting the bishop on f6, knight b4, bishop d4 check, king h1, rook takes, rook to e8, knight d5, bishop takes, e takes, rook e2, bishop f4, bishop c5, and these are the exemplary variations. But here, for example, white is a pawn up, but it's very difficult to convert this advantage. So knight c6, with knight c6, yes, white takes an extra pawn, but it will be very difficult to convert. But knight d5 was played, and here Karpov played queen c5 check. Exchanging the queen is not advisable, because before recapturing with the bishop, white will play knight f6 check, and if the queen returns to the d8 square, then we have another problem, because here after rook f6, knight takes f6, queen takes, bishop takes d6, unleashing the rook to the queen, queen e5, and here white can play c5, planting the bishop on d6, and after, for example, queen g7, rook f2, white is trying to double. Rook f7, rook takes, bishop takes, rook f1, rook to e8, and then e5, bishop d5, rook f6, queen h6, and then queen f2, and the attack for white is very strong. It's irresistible. It's almost winning in this position. So Karpov played queen c5. Excuse me, let me take a sip. Then king h1 was played. This is a very solid move, but there was a very quick win in this position, and after queen c5, and it was to play bishop e3, attacking the queen, and in return black could have played bishop g5. Now if bishop takes, then bishop takes can be played. Knight f6 check, white is trying to deflect this bishop and forking the king and the rook at the same time. So king h6, rook c to e1, protecting the bishop on e3, then rook f7 and e5. This is very important move. We are going to see why in a second. It basically disconnect the connection between queen and bishop. Bishop e3 check, rook takes e3, king g7, king h2, and d takes c5, rook e to f3, and now the threat is to play queen g5, e4, queen b2, threatening a discover check here, or if you are crazy enough here, king h6, and then knight e4. And this position is basically winning for white. But Karpov played very solidly. He played king h1, and bishop takes d5 was played. And the rest of the game is actually very easy. Here c takes d5 was played, again unleashing the rook to the queen. Queen d4. Black is trying to go into a pawn and game, pawn and rook end game, and it will increase its chance of getting obtaining a draw. But d takes c6 was played, b takes, rook takes. Now white is a pawn up, and after rook to e8. By the way, queen takes e4 is not advisable here, because for example after rook takes d6, rook takes, queen takes, bishop g7, bishop e3, rook to e8, rook f7, rook g8, rook d7, and white is winning. There's not a difference. Even white can win faster. So rook to e8 was played in this position, and the rest is very easy. Rook to c4, queen takes, bishop e5, and bishop e3, bishop g3. Kasparov is trying to push these pawns to h4 and then g5. So he's desperately trying to create a mating net. But after rook f3, h4, then bishop f2, now this bishop is going to be exchanged, and this pawn will be very weak in the rook end game. So bishop takes f2. Rook takes, rook d to e7, rook f4, g5, rook f6, attacking the d6 pawn. This rook end game is very easy, obviously. Rook takes e4, rook takes e4, rook takes e4, rook takes d6, and a clear pawn up for white. Rook to e7, rook a6. Now this pawn even cannot move, and this rook should be tied down to the defense of this pawn. So king g7, and after king g5, king g1, Karpov resigned. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please share, like, comment, and even tell your friends about us. And see you in the next video. Thank you very much.